Welcome back. We're going to talk about the pituitary gland, its regulation and its hormones, along with the pineal gland. These two glands are found in the brain. In this figure, you're looking at the three ways that the hypothalamus controls hormonal secretion. First, we see the control of the posterior pituitary gland. Neurons within the hypothalamus have axons which run down all the way to the posterior pituitary and directly secrete hormones there. Second, we see nuclei within the hypothalamus secreting hormones which then activate hormones of the anterior pituitary. And third, we see neurons from the hypothalamus running through the spinal cord to get to the adrenal medulla. We're going to focus on the pituitary gland, and we'll look at the role of the hypothalamus on a case-by-case basis. The pituitary gland is also called the hypophysis, hypo meaning below, and physis refers to that segment of the brain that includes the hypothalamus and the thalamus. The pituitary gland sits within the sella turcica, which you learned in A&P1 is a little depression in the base of the cranial floor of the skull that shields the pituitary gland from harm. The stalk that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus is called the infundibulum. Here in this diagram, you can see the bone of the sphenoid forming the socket called the sella turcica. There is a diaphragm or membrane that is an extension of the dura mater which seals the pituitary from the rest of the nerve tissue of the brain. This hypophyseal fossa, or depression where the hypophysis is located, is filled with the pituitary. Occasionally the pituitary may pop out of the hypophyseal fossa, the sella turcica, and the fossa will be empty. Usually this is associated with an endocrine disorder. The anterior lobe of the pituitary is divided into three parts. The posterior pituitary lobe is also called the neurohypophysis. The anterior lobe is also called the adenohypophysis. Adeno is a word root that just means glandular. So when you look at the anterior pituitary, the tissue looks like typical glandular tissue. The hormones of the anterior pituitary, for the most part, are going to stimulate other endocrine glands and turn on their hormonal secretion, as we'll see. Tumors of the pituitary gland can cause either a hyper or hyposecretion of either all of the hormones or just selected ones. The hypophyseal portal system is the blood supply that connects the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. Now, as we'll see when we get to the circulatory system, a portal system is a system in which capillary beds are linked directly to other capillary beds. In this case, as we'll see, there are capillary beds at the base of the hypothalamus, and they are directly connected to the capillary beds of the anterior pituitary gland. This direct connection allows hormones to run directly from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. So in this figure, you can see that there are neurosecretory neurons in the hypothalamus whose axons end right at this little capillary network. And when the neurons send nerve impulses, they actually secrete their hormones, and those hormones get into the bloodstream here and go straight to the anterior pituitary where they're going to have their effect. So there are two kinds of hormones secreted by the hypothalamus that regulate the function of the anterior pituitary. They are either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. And they're named for the hormone that they regulate, either by releasing it or inhibiting it. So, for example, TRH is thyrotropin releasing hormone. It releases or stimulates the release of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, from the anterior pituitary. CRH is corticotropin-releasing hormone, and it stimulates the secretion of ACTH from the anterior pituitary. GnRH is gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and it stimulates the release of two reproductive regulating hormones from the anterior pituitary. This is a very complicated diagram. It will help you a lot to pay attention to it. From the anterior pituitary, we see the secretion of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hormones, and a seventh hormone from this small lobe that sits between the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. You need to know all of these hormones by name, and you need to know basically what they do. We'll learn about the role of ACTH and TSH when we learn the glands, the adrenal cortex and the thyroid gland, that they regulate. We'll learn about PRL and FSH and LH when we study the reproductive system, and that won't even be on this test. We'll look very briefly at the role of MSH right now. MSH is melanocyte-stimulating hormone, and as far as we can tell in humans it has very little function, but it does seem to stimulate the secretion of melatonin in the skin cells that cause a pigmentation of the skin. Most notably, we see this when it's being hypersecreted and we have hyperpigmentation of the skin. In normal function, MSH has very little function in humans. That leaves us with GH, growth hormone, which, as you can see, stimulates the liver to secrete some intermediary hormones called somatomedins, which then stimulate growth. So growth hormone, also known as somatotropin, secreted by the anterior pituitary, is regulated by two hormones from the hypothalamus. GHRH is the releasing hormone, and GHIH is the inhibiting hormone from the hypothalamus. These hormones regulate growth hormone through a typical negative feedback regulatory loop. Growth hormone stimulates an increase in protein synthesis in many cells, including cartilage cells and muscle. Growth hormone most notably stimulates liver cells to secrete their own hormones called somatomedins. And somatomedins not only regulate growth, but they also provide some regulation of metabolic effects, along with causing the secretion of GHIH, or somatostatin, from the peripheral tissues. Abnormalities associated with growth hormone are typically seen in the bones. Without sufficient growth hormone in children, the skeleton fails to develop normally. This causes pituitary dwarfism. If growth hormone is secreted in excess, the timing matters. In children, an excess of growth hormone causes the formation of a condition called gigantism, whereas in adults, where the final adult height has already been achieved, the condition is acromegaly. And the difference is that in acromegaly, the bones grow thicker, but the individual does not grow any taller. In both of these conditions, not only the bones are affected, individual organs such as the liver can also grow very large. Thyrotropin, also known as TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, stimulates the production of the thyroid hormone. So we'll look at it in more detail when we look at the thyroid gland. TRH is the hormone from the hypothalamus that stimulates the secretion of TSH. Remember, RH stands for releasing hormone. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, also known as corticotropin, is secreted from the anterior pituitary when it is stimulated by CRH, corticotropin-releasing hormone, from the hypothalamus. The primary role of ACTH is to stimulate the secretion of glucocorticoids from the adrenal cortex. So we'll look at that in more detail when we get to the adrenal glands. FSH and LH are reproductive hormones. Their roles in male and female individuals will be studied in more detail when we get to the reproductive system. FSH and LH from the anterior pituitary are regulated by GnRH from the hypothalamus. That's gonadotropin releasing hormone. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland secretes only two hormones. The hormones are ADH and oxytocin. The posterior pituitary is actually nerve tissue. In fact, it's nothing more than the nerve endings of neurons that are found in the hypothalamus itself. These neurons are clustered into two nuclei, the supraoptic nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus. So, as you can see, the nuclei sit in the hypothalamus. Their axons run down through the infundibulum and end in the posterior pituitary. A nerve impulse from these neurons, here or here, will result in the release of the hormone from the posterior pituitary. So technically speaking, the hormone is actually produced up in the hypothalamus. It is stored in synaptic vesicles and released from the posterior pituitary only when a nerve impulse that starts in the hypothalamus comes down through the infundibulum to stimulate the release of what in any other neuron would be a neurotransmitter, but here, because it's getting into the bloodstream, we call it a neurohormone. ADH stimulates the kidneys. It also stimulates blood vessels. We'll look at it in more detail when we get to blood pressure regulation and kidney regulation. Oxytocin stimulates reproductive effects. Most notably, it triggers labor in childbirth and also triggers the nursing reflex. We'll look at that in more detail when we get to the reproductive system. So that's a quick run through of the pituitary gland. The other hormone-secreting gland in the brain is the pineal gland. You probably learned this in A&P1, at least the structure was identified. It sits right at the back side of the thalamus, right above the cerebellum. It's a little pine cone-shaped structure, barely a millimeter or two long. It secretes a hormone called melatonin. Melatonin is made from serotonin. Serotonin is a well-known neurotransmitter, and in general the pineal gland doesn't secrete serotonin. It produces it and then converts it to melatonin. The functions of melatonin in humans are not completely understood. It's much easier to understand the role of melatonin in other animals whose reproductive functions are very tightly tied either to seasonal effects or to particular behavioral effects. In humans, the role of melatonin is not entirely clear, but secretion of melatonin seems to inhibit reproductive functions. It also protects against damage by free radicals, and it definitely has an effect on circadian rhythms. Intriguingly, we know that the pineal gland receives nerve impulses from the eye by way of the thalamus. And so the pineal gland has a role in setting your daily cycle determined by how much light hits your eyes every day. So in the summer when days are long versus in winter when days are short, your pineal gland is keeping track of those seasonal changes. Well, that's it for the hormones of the brain. Stay tuned for our next episode of Endocrine Glands.